Tonight we begin with an unsettling truth spoken softly, the kind of truth that does not shout but lingers, like the final echo of a bell long after it has been struck. You are told that civilizations do not always collapse in fire and noise. Sometimes they fade in silence. Sometimes they are put to sleep. The story you are about to hear is not meant to convince you of anything, only to walk beside you as you drift through forgotten corridors of possibility, where Tartarian science still hums faintly beneath the dust of modern certainty. So, before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips, and give me some encouragement. And as you settle in, you are invited to post your local location and the time you are listening, as if pinning your presence gently onto a shared map of listeners across the world. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You wake in a world that feels finished, polished, explained, yet beneath that smooth surface, you sense something uneven, like floorboards covering a hollow space. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory. Humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison. And whether or not you believe that, the feeling is familiar, that history has rooms you were never shown. Tartarian science belongs to those rooms, not as a proven chapter, not as a textbook certainty, but as a quiet question that refuses to go away. You walk through old cities and notice how often they seem older than their stories. Stone foundations extend deeper than expected. Windows appear sealed at ground level, as if the earth itself rose suddenly, swallowing a former world. And you ask yourself, not angrily but gently, what kind of civilization builds so grandly, so consistently, across continents, only to vanish without a clear goodbye? Empires usually leave debris, weapons, bones, bitterness. Tartaria, whatever it was, leaves symmetry. It leaves alignment. It leaves the unsettling impression of intention. In bedtime stories, intention is the most powerful magic of all. Tartarian science, as whispered in forums and old illustrations, is not described as loud or explosive. It is described as calm, atmospheric, harmonious. You are told it worked with the world rather than against it. And that idea alone feels strange to modern ears, trained to associate technology with heat, smoke, and strain. What if advancement once meant silence instead of noise? What if power once meant balance rather than domination? You imagine a civilization that understood the air the way sailors understand water. A people who saw the atmosphere not as empty space, but as a medium, alive, with potential. Tartarian science, in this telling, does not rely on burning fuels ripped from the ground, but on drawing subtle energies already present. Not stolen energy, borrowed energy, the kind you return when you are finished. And as you imagine this, your breathing slows, because the idea itself is restful. There is no argument here, no demand that you accept the tale as fact. The wise old voice guiding you does not insist. It only asks, why do so many old structures seem designed not just to stand, but to tune something? Why the spires, the domes, the copper-tipped towers? Why the obsessive geometry repeated across lands that supposedly never spoke to one another? Coincidence is possible. Convenience is possible. But patterns invite bedtime, wondering. You think of star forts, their sharp geometry, like frozen sound waves pressed into the earth. Official explanations call them defensive, but you notice how often they face inward as much as outward, how symmetrical they are, how excessive their precision seems for simple warfare. Tartarian science, as a hypothesis, suggests these shapes mattered, that angles and proportions were chosen the way notes are chosen in music. And you wonder, as the night deepens, whether these places were meant to resonate rather than repel. As you move through this imagined world, you feel no fear. That is important. This story is not about catastrophe yet. It is about what came before the quiet. Tartaria, in the conspiracy-tinged lullaby you are hearing, was not a land of tyrants or monsters. It was a system, a way of organizing knowledge so seamlessly into architecture, water flow, sound, and light that it appears invisible once forgotten, like a dream you cannot fully recall, but whose mood stays with you all day. Then comes the silence. Not the dramatic silence of an explosion's aftermath, but the administrative silence of records changed, maps redrawn, names reassigned. You are told there was a reset, not a single moment, but a process. Exhibitions that reframed the past, textbooks that simplified timelines, disasters that buried evidence under mud and rubble, conveniently explained as natural. And you listen, not to judge, but to feel the emotional texture of such a loss. How does a world forget something that once surrounded it? Perhaps forgetting is easier than remembering, especially if remembering would force uncomfortable questions. If Tartarian science existed, even partially, it suggests humanity once knew how to live differently, more quietly, more cooperatively, and that thought alone challenges modern assumptions about progress. You are not told this to make you angry. You are told this so you can rest with the idea that history may not be a straight line upward, but a circle with many erased arcs. As the wise voice continues, it reminds you that every age believes itself to be the most advanced. Yet every age also inherits ruins it cannot explain. Tartaria may be one such inheritance, or it may be a collage of misunderstandings, romantic projections, and half-truths. But even half-truths have weight. Even myths form around something solid enough to cast a shadow. And shadows, in bedtime stories, are not threats. They are invitations to look more closely. You begin to sense the rhythm of this journey. Each section will not rush. It will walk. It will show you canals that feel like circuits, halls that feel like instruments, and technologies that blur into architecture until the distinction disappears. Tartarian science is not presented as gadgets and machines, but as environments, as cities that function like organisms. And organisms, when healthy, do not scream. They hum. The night outside grows quieter as you imagine bells that once rang not for timekeeping, but for tuning the air, hospitals that healed with sound, transportation that glided rather than roared. None of this is offered as proof. It is offered as possibility, and possibility is a soft pillow for the mind. You are allowed to believe, or not believe. The story does not mind. It simply continues. Before you drift deeper, the voice asks one last question for this section, gentle and unforced. If such knowledge were lost, would it look like theft, or would it look like modernization? Would it come with violence, or with paperwork? And would you even notice? Generations later, if the world had once been quieter, kinder, and more connected than the one you inherited. These questions are not meant to keep you awake. They are meant to settle beside you, like a cat curling at your feet, warm and curious, but calm. Tartarian science, whether myth or memory, invites you into a slower way of thinking, a way that does not demand conclusions tonight. Only presence. You exhale. The ruins fade into a soft outline. The hum becomes barely audible, and as section 1 closes, you find yourself standing at the edge of a forgotten city, not afraid to step forward, but not in a hurry either. There is time. There is always time. In stories told before sleep, you do not leave the ruins when you wake this time. Instead, you find yourself standing inside them, as if the story has gently carried you forward without asking permission. The silence from before has not lifted. It has deepened, and in that deeper quiet, you begin to notice shapes sharp, deliberate, almost too perfect to feel accidental. These are not castles in the fairy tale sense. They are star forts, and the moment you recognize their form, something inside you understands that walls are not the point. You walk along angular paths that radiate outward like frozen ripples, From above, you know, these structures resemble stars, snowflakes, mandalas pressed into soil and stone. Official history tells you they were built for defense, optimized against cannon fire. Yet, as you move through them slowly, your footsteps echo in strange, measured ways. Sound does not scatter here. It behaves. It follows angles. It lingers, then fades evenly, as if the space itself is listening. You pause and ask yourself a bedtime question, the kind with no urgency. Why would purely defensive structures need such precise symmetry? Why repeat the same geometry across continents, climates, cultures? Coincidence is comforting, but repetition at this scale feels intentional. Tartarian science, as whispered rather than proven, suggests these forts were not merely barriers, they were instruments. You imagine them as tuning forks embedded into the land, their points not aimed outward in aggression, but arranged to interact with invisible flows, wind, vibration, resonance. You remember how earlier you were invited to think of technology not as machines, but as environments. Standing here, that idea no longer feels abstract. The fort surrounds you. You are inside the mechanism. The wise old voice guiding you does not insist that these places generated power in a modern electrical sense. Instead, it nudges you toward an older understanding of energy. Energy as movement, as balance, as relationship. In this view, the star fort does not produce force. It organizes it, like a bowl shaping water or a flute shaping breath. You trace a hand along cool stone and feel grooves worn smooth by time. These walls have endured floods, wars, neglect, and repurposing, yet their underlying form remains. That endurance itself feels like evidence of knowledge beyond brute strength. You notice how many star forts sit near waterways, how often they align with cardinal directions, how their moats resemble controlled channels rather than simple ditches. Water again, geometry again. Always the same quiet companions. You lie back on the ground at the center of one such fort, staring up at the night sky that mirrors the shape beneath you. Star above, star below. The symmetry calms you. You think of ancient traditions that believed heaven and earth were reflections, not opposites. Tartarian science, in this lullaby telling, seems to belong to that worldview, a science that does not separate the sacred from the functional, a science where beauty is utility. As sleepiness creeps closer, the voice invites you to consider another gentle contrast. Modern fortifications grow taller, thicker, heavier. They intimidate. These older ones seem to invite observation. They guide movement. They almost want to be walked, traced, understood. What kind of mind designs defenses that double as contemplative spaces? You imagine soldiers not just standing guard here, but living within a system that subtly regulated sound, crowd movement, even emotion. Calm spaces create calm people. Harmonized spaces discourage chaos. Perhaps the true defense was not against enemies, but against disorder itself, against panic, against imbalance. The night air cools as you move on, passing through gates that feel ceremonial rather than militaristic. You realize that if these were weapons, they were weapons of environment, of psychology, of resonance, and that idea feels strangely modern, yet deeply old at the same time. The voice does not claim certainty. It never does. Instead, it offers you a final image for this section. Star forts as paused music, notes waiting for players long gone. Their silence is not emptiness, but rest. And as you leave their geometry behind, you carry that stillness with you, ready to drift into the next forgotten space. You do not travel far before the stone begins to rise, not outward like walls, but upward, as if the earth itself decided to stretch and breathe. The star fort geometry softens behind you, dissolving into streets that lead toward towers, domes, and arches so tall they seem to thin the sky. You enter a cathedral, though that word feels too small for what surrounds you. This is not merely a place of worship. It feels like a chamber, a lung, a gathering space for something invisible. The air inside is cooler, calmer. Your footsteps echo and then return to you altered, softened, smoothed. Sound behaves differently here. It does not bounce chaotically. It spirals. It settles. You lower your voice without being told to. The building has already instructed your body, and you wonder, in that slow bedtime way, whether that instruction was accidental. Cathedrals, the voice reminds you, are officially described as monuments to faith, and perhaps they are, but faith itself is not separate from environment. Faith is influenced by light, by height, by resonance, by the way breath expands in large spaces. Tartarian science, in this whispered interpretation, did not divide spiritual experience from technological understanding. It braided them together so tightly that later generations could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. You tilt your head back and follow the lines upward. Arches rise in repeating patterns, drawing your eyes higher and higher until thought itself seems to thin. Domes curve overhead like inverted bowls, their proportions precise, their centers carefully marked. You notice how often these structures incorporate copper, gold leaf, iron rods, bells, organs, materials chosen not just for beauty, but for interaction, for conductivity, for response. The voice does not rush to call this energy harvesting. That phrase is too sharp, too modern, too eager. Instead, it asks you to imagine the cathedral as a place of atmospheric conversation, a structure that listens to the air, shapes it, returns it, altered. Wind enters through hidden passages. Sound rises and circulates. Heat moves upward and outward. Light refracts through stained glass, not randomly, but rhythmically, hour by hour. You sit on a worn wooden bench and feel how the space seems to slow your pulse. That slowing is important. A calmer body perceives more. Perhaps these buildings were designed to regulate human states as much as environmental ones. Tartarian science, if it existed in this form, may have understood that the most powerful technology is the one that changes how you feel without announcing itself. You think of bells, not alarms, not clocks, but vast instruments tuned to specific tones, bells that could be heard across cities, across fields, across water, bells that did more than mark time, bells that marked coherence. You imagine their vibrations traveling through stone, through air, through bodies, gently aligning everything they touched, not commanding, harmonizing. Why so tall? You ask yourself. Why so consistent in form across regions that supposedly developed independently? Height increases exposure to wind, to pressure changes, to atmospheric electricity. You remember how lightning seeks spires, how static gathers at points, and suddenly, the shapes around you feel less symbolic and more practical. Though practicality here does not mean crude, it means elegant. The wise voice is careful. It does not say these cathedrals were power plants. It says they may have been interfaces, places where humans met forces larger than themselves in controlled, nurturing ways, where the invisible was made gentle rather than dangerous, where the sky was invited indoors. You stand beneath the dome and whisper a word. It returns to you layered, elongated, transformed. Your own voice surprises you, and you smile softly, because the experience itself is enough. Proof is not required for comfort. The comfort comes from imagining a world that built with listening in mind. As you drift toward the exit, you notice how many of these structures were later stripped, rewired, repurposed, bells removed, organs silenced, copper replaced. The shells remain, but the song is gone. You feel no anger at this, only a quiet sadness, like entering a grand instrument that has not been tuned in centuries. Outside, the night air feels different now, thinner, charged. You carry with you the sense that architecture once spoke a language you are only beginning to hear. And as the cathedral fades behind you, the story continues its gentle walk forward, leaving you ready to follow the next thread, unhurried, unafraid. You step back into the streets, and almost immediately, the ground beneath you feels uncertain, not unstable, but layered, as if the earth remembers more than it shows. You notice windows cut in half by pavement, doors that open into nothing, staircases descending where no lower floor is meant to exist. This is where the story slows further, because here, the evidence does not rise upward like cathedrals. It sinks. The voice beside you grows quieter, almost conspiratorial, though still kind. It tells you this is the language of mudflood layers. Not a single event, not a single date, but a pattern found again and again across old cities. Entire lower stories buried, former street levels sealed away, buildings that appear oddly squat now, but once stood tall and balanced. You are not asked to fear catastrophe. You are asked to notice consistency. You kneel and brush your fingers along stone that was never meant to be underground. It is finished stone, decorative stone, the kind used where people lived, worked, gathered, not foundations, not basements, living space. And you ask yourself, softly, why living space would be entombed so uniformly, across continents, under layers of compacted earth. Official explanations speak of gradual build-up, of renovations, of rising street levels over centuries, and perhaps that is true, in part, but bedtime stories are allowed to ask what if. What if something happened quickly enough to bury cities without completely destroying them? What if the disaster was muddy rather than fiery? What if survival required covering, sealing, forgetting? Tartarian science, in this gentle telling, does not claim the mud was accidental, nor does it insist it was malicious. Instead, it frames the burial as a transition, a reset that preserved structure while erasing function. Like closing a book without tearing its pages, you imagine waterlogged streets, flowing earth, silence settling in layers. You walk through an old building where the lower level is now a museum, glassed off, labeled original. The word feels heavy. Original implies replacement. You feel the absence of explanation more than the presence of plaques. And you realize how easy it would be, generations later, to accept this as normal, to assume the city was always like this. Memory, after all, is a fragile technology. The wise voice reminds you that Tartarian science, as a system embedded into architecture and infrastructure, would not vanish in flames. It would vanish in coverage, in repurposing, in renaming. Once the lower levels were sealed, once the old flow systems were blocked, once the harmonics were interrupted, the technology would stop functioning without appearing broken. It would simply become inert. You imagine canals clogged, resonance chambers filled, atmospheric pathways cut off, a machine that still exists physically, but no longer breathes. And you think of how many old structures feel like that now. Beautiful, impressive, but strangely empty, like instruments in a museum behind glass. The mudflood layers, whether literal or symbolic, represent something deeper, the burying of a worldview that understood environment as participant rather than resource. Once buried, a new mindset could rise on top. One louder, one more extractive. One convinced it was inventing everything for the first time. As you stand and brush the dust from your hands, the city around you feels older and younger at once. Older beneath, younger above. You feel no urgency to resolve the mystery. The story does not need resolution tonight. It only needs you to notice how many forgotten flaws lie beneath your feet as you walk through the modern world. And as you continue forward, the ground feels solid again. But you carry with you the quiet awareness that silence often comes layered, not sudden. Just like sleep, you leave the buried streets behind and step into open air, where the horizon stretches and the sky feels closer than it should. The voice with you grows softer now, almost playful, as if sharing a secret it does not insist you keep. This is where the story begins to speak of ether, atmosphere, and silent power, not as declarations, but as bedtime riddles that glow faintly in the dark. Long before wires and engines, people named the space between things. They called it ether. Not empty, never empty. A subtle medium through which light travelled, through which forces whispered. Modern science let the word go, but the feeling remains. You sense it when the air changes before a storm, when your skin tingles near high places, when silence feels charged rather than calm. Tartarian science, in this telling, is inseparable from that forgotten idea, not because it relied on mystical fantasy, but because it refused to see the atmosphere as void. You imagine a civilization that studied wind the way we study circuitry, pressure gradients instead of voltage, resonance instead of current, flow instead of consumption. You walk across a wide field dotted with old towers, their tops sharpened, capped, sometimes broken. They look like abandoned punctuation marks, finishing sentences no one reads anymore. Why so many towers? Why so tall? Why placed where lightning often strikes, where winds converge, where vistas open in all directions? Defensive explanations feel thin here. Observation makes more sense. Interaction makes more sense. The voice does not say free energy loudly. It knows that phrase carries heat, argument, disappointment. Instead, it lets you imagine energy that was simply there, like sunlight or rain, gathered gently, used carefully, and released, not hoarded, not weaponized, borrowed from the sky. You sit on a stone ledge and close your eyes. You picture air moving around structures designed to shape it, domes that trap pressure differences, spires that collect static, copper lines that guide subtle currents, water channels that ground excess. It sounds almost like music theory rather than engineering. And maybe it was. The wise old tone reminds you that every technology reflects its values. A civilization obsessed with speed invents engines. One obsessed with control invents weapons. A civilization obsessed with harmony might invent resonance. Tartarian science, if it ever existed, may have valued balance above output, stability above expansion, quiet continuity over explosive growth. You think again of cathedrals, of star forts, of buried floors. Seen separately, they are curiosities. Seen together, they feel like parts of a single system, not a grid, but a field, not centralized, but distributed. A world-spanning conversation with the atmosphere itself. The night deepens as clouds drift overhead. You imagine those clouds once being read, not predicted by screens but listened to by structures. Weather as dialogue, not threat. Storms guided, softened, dispersed by architecture placed with care. This is not presented as fact. It is presented as a question you are allowed to fall asleep thinking about. What if power does not need to roar? What if the most advanced systems hum so softly that only the attentive notice? What if losing such systems would not feel like loss at first, but like modernization, brighter lights, faster movement, louder proof? You open your eyes and the field feels peaceful. The towers stand silent, patient. They do not demand belief. They simply exist, like elders whose stories are still available if you sit long enough. As you continue your journey, the air around you feels alive, responsive, and whether that is imagination or memory no longer matters. The story has already done its work. Your thoughts slow, your breathing evens. The idea of silent power settles into you like a lullaby, ready to carry you onward. You do not notice the materials at first. They are too familiar to feel important. Copper glints softly in lamplight. Crystal catches reflections without effort. Wood, stone, and iron sit quietly in their places. Tartarian science, the voice reminds you, was never about rare substances. It was about arrangement, about how simple things behave when they are shaped, braided, and positioned with intention. You walk into a workshop that feels older than industry. No smoke, no clatter, just benches, worn smooth by hands that worked patiently. Coils of copper rest against stone walls, not thick and aggressive, but thin, layered, graceful. Glass spheres sit nearby, some clear, some clouded, some faintly iridescent. They look decorative until you imagine them listening. Crystal has always occupied a strange place between science and myth. It forms with mathematical precision, stores stress, responds to pressure with charge. Modern devices still use it, though rarely with reverence. Tartarian science, in this gentle retelling, treated crystal not as magic, but as memory, a way to hold vibration steady, a way to translate motion into signal without loss. You pick up a copper braid and feel its weight. Copper does not resist. It welcomes flow. It bends without breaking. You think of how often old buildings hid copper within their walls, beneath their floors, along their roofs, not for ornament, not for theft deterrence, but for conversation. Copper listens to movement. It responds to change. The voice does not claim these workshops powered cities directly. It suggests something subtler. These materials tuned environments. They stabilized systems. They smoothed fluctuations. A city built with resonant materials would feel different to live in. Calmer, more coherent, less draining. You imagine crystal embedded in foundations, aligning structures with natural frequencies, copper tracing pathways that guided subtle currents, the way nerves guide impulses, wood chosen for grain and density, not just strength. Stone selected for acoustic response as much as durability. Nothing wasted, nothing overbuilt. You notice how modern construction values speed and cost above all else. Uniformity replaces responsiveness. Tartarian science, if it existed, appears to have valued feedback. How does this space feel? How does sound move here? How does water flow? How does air behave at dawn versus dusk? The wise voice leans closer now, as if sharing something tender. It tells you that when systems are designed to resonate, they also heal themselves. Stress disperses instead of concentrating. Failure becomes gradual rather than catastrophic. This kind of engineering leaves fewer dramatic ruins, but more enduring shells. You sit and imagine wearing clothes woven with conductive threads, buildings that adjust naturally to temperature, streets that subtly guide movement without signs or barriers. None of this requires advanced machinery, only understanding, only patience. As sleepiness thickens, the workshop fades, leaving behind the idea that technology does not have to look like progress to be advanced. Sometimes it looks like craftsmanship, like quiet mastery passed hand to hand. Not patented or branded, you stand and step back into the night, carrying the memory of copper's warmth and crystal's stillness. Tartarian science continues to reveal itself not as spectacle, but as whisper. And whispers are easier to follow when you are almost asleep. Water finds you before you seek it. A soft sound at first, then a widening presence. You follow it instinctively, as if your body remembers something your mind does not. Canals stretch ahead, reflecting moonlight in steady lines. Fountains breathe rhythmically, rising and falling without urgency. In this part of the journey, Tartarian science speaks through water not as scenery, but as circuitry. You kneel at the edge of a canal and watch the surface ripple. It is not chaotic. It moves with purpose, guided by stone edges shaped with care. The voice beside you reminds you that water is never just water. It carries heat. It carries minerals. It carries vibration. And perhaps most importantly, it carries memory. Modern thinking treats water as something to be controlled or consumed. Pipes hide it. Pumps force it. Tartarian science, in this bedtime telling, treated water as a partner. Channels were laid not simply to move water from one place to another, but to guide flow in ways that stabilized entire environments. You walk along the canal and notice how often it curves gently rather than sharply. Abrupt angles create turbulence. Gentle curves preserve coherence. You notice how water levels remain consistent without obvious mechanical intervention. Gravity does the work. Balance does the rest. Fountains appear at intersections, not randomly placed but carefully spaced. Each one seems to release pressure, aerate flow, reset rhythm. You imagine them acting like valves in a living system, preventing stagnation, maintaining clarity. A city that listens to its water would feel alive. The voice does not insist that water remembers in a mystical sense. It invites you to consider that water responds to sound, to vibration, to containment. Experiments, dismissed or ignored, have shown patterns forming when water is exposed to different frequencies. Whether or not you accept those findings, the idea itself is calming. That water is sensitive. You imagine Tartarian engineers standing barefoot in canals, feeling flow through their bodies, adjusting stone placement by sensation rather than calculation alone. Measurement existed, but it was paired with listening, with patience. You think of how many old cities were built around waterways that no longer serve their original purpose. Canals filled, fountains shut off, rivers redirected underground. When water's role changes, the city's rhythm changes with it. Perhaps something essential was lost when water stopped being seen as an active component of urban life. You sit by a fountain and listen to its sound. It is not loud enough to demand attention, but steady enough to soothe. The sound masks sharper noises, smooths the acoustic environment. Water as white noise. Water as calming technology. As you rest there, the night deepens. Reflections blur. The voice suggests one final image. Water networks acting like nervous systems, distributing not just moisture but information. Temperature shifts, pressure changes, subtle signals that the rest of the city could respond to. You rise slowly, reluctant to leave the canals behind. But the journey continues, and water has done its part. It has slowed you, grounded you, prepared you to imagine movement itself, how people once travelled through such environments without smoke or strain. And as you walk on, the sound of flowing water follows you in memory, steady and reassuring, like breath. You begin to notice the absence before you notice the idea. There are no ruts here, no deep scars in the stone where heavy wheels once ground endlessly. The roads feel smooth, intentional, almost gentle. As you walk them, you sense that movement itself was once quieter, less violent. Tartarian science, in this part of the story, reveals itself not through what is present, but through what is missing. You follow a long, straight path that stretches toward the horizon, lined with stones set flush and even. These are not primitive roads thrown down in haste. They are engineered surfaces, designed for glide rather than struggle. You imagine vehicles that did not rely on hooves or smoke, but on balance, weight distribution, perhaps even subtle lift. The voice beside you speaks softly of skyways, not highways in the modern sense, but elevated routes, cables, rails, or corridors that allowed movement above ground clutter. Old illustrations show airships drifting between towers, tethered lightly like balloons at rest. Are these fantasies, symbols, or memories exaggerated by time? The story does not demand an answer. You pause beneath a tall spire and notice rings, brackets, anchor points high above. Too high for flags, too sturdy for decoration. Mooring points, perhaps, or perhaps something else entirely. The point is not certainty. The point is how often these features appear, scattered across old cities that no longer remember why they were built. Travel, in this imagined world, does not dominate the landscape. It integrates with it. Roads curve with terrain. Elevated paths avoid disruption below. Movement produces minimal noise. You imagine cities where transport hums rather than roars, where distance feels smaller because travel does not exhaust. The wise voice reminds you that advanced systems often leave the lightest footprints. Heavy infrastructure suggests inefficiency. Elegance suggests understanding. Tartarian science, if it shaped transportation, may have prioritized flow over force. You think of how modern travel separates you from environment, windows closed, engines loud, attention diverted. Older travel systems, in this telling, may have kept people present, aware of wind, light, sound, traveler's experience, not obstacle. As you continue along the road, your steps feel effortless. The surface seems to guide you forward, and for a moment, you imagine gliding, rolling, moving without friction. The image relaxes you. Speed is not the goal. Ease is. The road fades into night, and with it, the sense that movement itself can be kind. Tartarian science, at least in this dreamlike interpretation, understood that how you move through the world shapes how you think about it. The road carries you gently into a city that does not feel busy, even though it is full. Lights glow without glare. Streets curve without confusion. Everything seems to know where it belongs. You sense it immediately. This is a place where effort has been reduced, not intensified, where systems quietly take over the burdens that once weighed on human hands. Tartarian science, in this chapter of the journey, reveals itself as gentle automation. You walk past buildings whose doors open smoothly, without hinges that squeal or mechanisms that resist. Inside, you glimpse wheels turning slowly, belts moving with patience, counterweights rising and falling in measured cycles. There is no urgency here, no frantic motion. The machines do not replace people, they support them. The voice beside you lowers even further, as if careful not to disturb the calm. It tells you that clockwork once meant more than timekeeping. It meant predictable motion, repeatable balance, a way to let forces work steadily without supervision. You think of old clocks that ran for decades with minimal intervention, their inner worlds humming faithfully, while generations passed outside. You wander through a market where goods are lifted, sorted, and distributed by simple mechanisms embedded into the architecture itself. Pulleys, hidden in beams, rotating platforms beneath stone floors, gravity doing most of the labor. Human hands guide, adjust, decide, but they do not strain. This is not automation driven by speed. It is automation driven by relief, relief from exhaustion, relief from repetition. Tartarian science, in this telling, did not chase productivity for its own sake. It sought sustainability of the human spirit. You pause near a central square and notice how sound behaves. No shouting, no competing noise. The layout disperses, echoes, absorbs clamor. The city itself manages sensory load. You imagine how much calmer daily life would feel when the environment carries part of the emotional weight. The wise voice reminds you that true automation is invisible. When it works well, it feels like ease rather than control. Modern systems often demand attention screens, alerts, maintenance. These older ones seem to fade into the background, allowing people to remain present with one another. You sit on a bench that gently adjusts its angle as you rest, responding to your weight without conscious input. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is memory resurfacing in metaphor. Either way, your body relaxes, and relaxation itself feels like evidence. You think of how cities today strain under their own complexity. Systems layered atop systems, each demanding oversight. Here, simplicity reigns. Few parts, clear roles, feedback loops that correct slowly rather than catastrophically. Clockwork cities, in this bedtime vision, are not rigid. They are adaptive. They breathe with daily cycles. They slow at night. They awaken with the sun. Energy use follows natural rhythms rather than forcing them. As you rise to leave, the city continues without you. Nothing depends on your presence to function. And that, strangely, feels comforting. Tartarian science whispers that a good system does not need constant management. It needs understanding. You walk on, carrying with you the feeling that progress once meant making life lighter, not faster. And as the city fades behind you, the rhythm of its gentle mechanisms echoes like a lullaby, guiding you toward the next threshold. You notice the change not by sight, but by sensation. The air feels different here, thicker, softer, as if it has been tuned. You slow your pace without realizing it, drawn toward a building that does not announce itself as a place of healing, yet feels unmistakably restorative. Tartarian science, in this part of the journey, reveals a quieter understanding of medicine, not intervention. Alignment. You enter a hall where the walls curve gently, avoiding sharp corners. Light filters in from above, diffused and warm. There is no smell of chemicals, no harsh brightness. Instead, there is sound, or rather, a careful absence of it. A low hum exists at the edge of perception, like distant chanting you cannot quite hear. The voice beside you speaks with great care now. It tells you that long before pills and procedures, healing was associated with frequency, with vibration, with rhythm. The body, after all, is not solid in the way stone is solid. It pulses, it resonates, it responds. You sit on a stone platform worn smooth by countless others before you. As you rest, you feel subtle vibrations through the surface, not enough to startle, only enough to reassure. Your breathing slows, muscles soften, thoughts lengthen. This place does not fix you. It invites your body to remember how to balance itself. You look around and notice instruments that resemble musical devices more than medical tools. Long strings stretched across frames, tubes of varying lengths, bowls that look designed to be struck, not with force, but with intention. The voice suggests that these were not performances. They were prescriptions. Sound travels differently here. Notes do not clash. They overlap, weave, dissolve. You imagine tones selected not for melody, but for effect. Lower frequencies to ground, higher ones to clear, complex harmonics to gently stimulate repair. Healing as conversation, not command. The wise voice does not deny modern medicine. It simply reminds you that not all healing requires intrusion. Some healing requires removal of stress, of noise, of imbalance. Tartarian science, if it touched medicine, may have focused on creating conditions where the body could do what it already knows how to do. You think of how often illness today feels accelerated by environment. Constant alerts, artificial light, unnatural schedules. In contrast, this hall seems designed to protect circadian rhythms, to honor rest, to let time move at a biological pace. You lie back and close your eyes. For a moment, you imagine a city where hospitals are quiet sanctuaries, rather than battlegrounds, where recovery is supported by architecture, sound, and community, rather than fought aggressively. The image does not argue. It soothes. As you leave the healing hall, you feel no dramatic transformation, no miracle, just a subtle lightness, and that feels appropriate. Tartarian science, in this telling, never chased spectacle. It trusted slow, steady alignment. You step back into the night, carrying with you the idea that healing can be gentle, that medicine can sound like music, and that sometimes the most advanced care feels like rest. You feel the shift before you see it. The air tightens slightly, as if listening. Above you, clouds drift with unusual discipline, stretching into long, brushed lines rather than tumbling freely. The voice walking beside you does not call this control. It calls it relationship. Tartarian science, in this chapter of the journey, turns its gaze upward, toward weather not as an enemy, but as a companion. You stand beneath a tall tower that rises without aggression. It does not stab the sky. It meets it. Rings encircle its upper levels. Openings allow wind to pass through rather than collide. You notice how similar structures appear again and again in old cities, often dismissed as watchtowers, signal posts, or decorative spires. But standing here, you sense that watching was only part of their purpose. The wise voice speaks slowly now, as if careful not to disturb the clouds themselves. It reminds you that weather is not random in the way people often assume. It follows patterns, responds to pressure, shifts with subtle triggers. A civilization that understood resonance, flow, and atmosphere might also understand how to influence weather without forcing it. You imagine towers acting as tuning devices rather than weapons, structures that equalized pressure, redirected wind, dissipated electrical buildup before storms could grow violent, not stopping weather, but smoothing it, calming it, like speaking softly to an animal rather than trying to overpower it. You walk between several such towers and notice how the wind behaves differently here. It moves evenly. It does not gust. Leaves drift rather than scatter. Whether this is imagination or suggestion no longer matters. The effect is calming. And calm, you realize, is a form of protection. Tartarian science, as this bedtime story frames it, would not seek domination over nature. Domination creates backlash. Instead, it would seek alignment. The same principles used in healing halls and water systems would apply here. Listen first, adjust gently, allow balance to reassert itself. You think of old accounts describing sudden fogs, softened storms, rains that arrived exactly when needed. Folklore often preserves technical memory in poetic form. Perhaps weather wardens once existed not sorcerers, but engineers of atmosphere, misunderstood by later generations who lost the language of their work. The voice does not ask you to believe this literally. It asks you to notice how modern systems approach weather almost exclusively through prediction, not participation. Satellites watch, screens warn, but no one speaks to the sky anymore. No one builds with weather in mind beyond resistance. You lie back on cool grass and watch clouds pass between the towers. For a moment, you imagine a world where cities cooperated with climate instead of fighting it, where floods were guided, not feared, where storms were softened, not sensationalized. As the night deepens, the clouds thin, stars peek through. The towers remain quiet and patient, no longer active perhaps, but still shaped by a forgotten understanding. You rise slowly, feeling small but not insignificant beneath the sky, and as you walk on, the idea settles into you like mist, that even the weather may once have been part of a larger, gentler system, and that remembering this possibility is enough for tonight. You come upon the maps when you are not looking for them. They appear folded into drawers, etched into stone, printed faintly on aging paper that smells of dust and time. At first glance, they look familiar. Continents, oceans, lines and labels. But as you linger, something begins to feel wrong in a quiet, unsettling way. Tartarian science, in this stretch of the journey, reveals itself not through machines or buildings, but through orientation itself. You trace a finger along coastlines that seem slightly off, landmasses stretched or compressed in ways your memory resists. The poles are not where you expect them to be. Some maps place the north differently. Others seem to favor a central landmass that no longer exists in official geography. You do not feel alarmed. You feel curious, as if you are looking at a dream version of the world that still carries logic, just not the one you were taught. The voice beside you grows thoughtful. It reminds you that maps are not neutral. They are agreements. They reflect what a culture values, what it centers, what it ignores. To change a map is not just to change directions, but to change meaning. Tartarian science, if it was global in nature, would require a worldview that saw the planet as a connected system rather than divided territories. You notice how many old maps emphasize flow instead of borders. Rivers dominate. Mountain ranges feel alive rather than obstructive. Cities appear as nodes, not capitals. There is less emphasis on ownership, more on relationship. The world feels navigable rather than conquered. Some maps include lands now called mythical. Tartaria itself sprawls across regions that modern atlases fragment into many nations. Perhaps this was political exaggeration. Perhaps it was shorthand. Or perhaps it reflects a time before rigid borders, when shared infrastructure mattered more than flags. The wise voice does not insist that the world was physically different. It suggests something subtler, that orientation changed, that humanity's relationship to space, direction, and centrality was altered. When orientation changes, memory follows. You think of how easy it is to forget paths you no longer walk. If trade routes dissolve, if technologies disappear, if travel patterns shift, the mental map of the world collapses inward. What once felt connected begins to feel distant, even imaginary. As you roll the map closed, you realize this section of the story is not about proving lost continents. It is about noticing how knowledge can be rearranged without being destroyed. How a world can be redrawn softly over generations until no one remembers the previous version. You step away from the maps feeling slightly unsteady, but not afraid. The ground beneath you is still there. Only your sense of direction has loosened, and perhaps that is the point. Tartarian science, like these maps, invites you to question not where you are, but how you know where you are. The night deepens, and the idea of a world once mapped differently drifts with you, gentle and unresolved, as you move onward. The first thing you notice is the door. It rises above you, taller than comfort, taller than habit. Its handle sits high, not placed for ease, but for reach. You stand before it and feel small, though not insignificant. Tartarian science, in this part of the journey, asks you to think about scale and about who a world is built for. You step inside structures where ceilings soar far beyond practical necessity. Staircases stretch wide, their steps shallow, as if designed for longer strides. Windows sit higher than eye level, flooding rooms with light meant to fall from above, not from the side. Everything feels proportioned differently. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. The voice beside you does not rush to speak of giants. It knows how easily that word excites and distracts. Instead, it invites you to consider perspective. Architecture is a language. It speaks of bodies, movements, expectations. When proportions repeat across regions, across building types, across centuries, they whisper of consistent assumptions about the people who would use them. You run your hand along a stone banister worn smooth by countless touches. The wear patterns sit higher than your hand naturally falls. Someone else leaned here, someone taller, or perhaps people moved differently. Upright posture emphasized, strides longer, spines extended by environments that encouraged expansion rather than compression. Tartarian science, in this lullaby telling, does not insist on mythical beings towering over modern humans. It suggests something quieter, that humanity itself may have changed. Nutrition, environment, atmosphere, gravity, perception, even subtle differences, sustained over generations, could alter average size, strength, and endurance. You imagine a world with cleaner air, resonant cities, gentler labor, bodies growing into spaces that support them. Compare that to a world of cramped housing, polluted skies, constant stress. Bodies adapt, always have. You walk through halls where doors align in vertical sequences, one above another, as if floors once existed that are now gone. The mud flood layers you saw earlier return to your mind. If lower levels were buried, then what appears oversized today may once have been perfectly scaled. The wise voice reminds you that giants appear in myths across cultures, not because they were monsters, but because they were remembered as different, larger, stronger, longer-lived. Myth often preserves memory when language fails. You pause in a courtyard and look up at statues whose heads nearly touch the sky. Their proportions feel slightly off, not grotesque, but elongated. They look serene, not dominant, built to honor something familiar, not fantastical. As you leave these towering spaces behind, the feeling of smallness fades. You are not diminished. You are simply aware that the world may once have accommodated a broader range of human experience. Tartarian science, in this sense, was not just about machines or energy. It was about designing for life as it was lived then, not as it is lived now. The night air settles around you. The doors close softly behind. And you carry forward the gentle question, did we shrink, or did our world? You arrive where the sound should be. You expect footsteps, whispers, the soft friction of pages turning. Instead, there is a hollow, quiet, that feels deliberate, not accidental. Shelves stretch upward, empty but polished, as if something once rested there with care. Tartarian science, in this portion of the journey, reveals itself through absence, through knowledge that vanished without smoke. Libraries, the voice reminds you gently, do not always burn. Sometimes they are emptied. Sometimes their contents are renamed, reclassified, scattered into smaller rooms where they no longer speak to one another. Fire leaves drama. Silence leaves compliance. You walk slowly between rows that once held volumes, heavy with diagrams, measurements, observations made over lifetimes. You imagine books that did not separate art from engineering, medicine from music, astronomy from architecture, knowledge arranged not by subject, but by relationship. The wise voice speaks of a time when learning was cumulative rather than competitive, when discoveries were not rushed to publication, but integrated into practice. Tartarian science, if preserved in such libraries, would not look like formulas alone. It would look like instructions for living within systems, how to build, how to listen, how to maintain balance over generations. You notice scorch marks nowhere, no collapsed beams, just clean floors and repurposed spaces. Offices now, storage, exhibits. The building remains, but its purpose has shifted. Memory removed without violence. You think of how easy it is to change understanding by changing what is available. Remove a few key texts. Simplify timelines. Replace complexity with progress narratives. Soon, no one asks why certain buildings exist. They simply admire them. The voice does not accuse. It observes. It suggests that after a reset, people needed new explanations. Old knowledge may have felt dangerous, confusing, or incompatible with emerging power structures. Forgetting can feel like safety. You pause by a window and imagine scholars sitting here, not racing deadlines, but watching the sky, recording patterns, comparing notes across continents, knowledge traveling slowly, but deeply. Contrast that with today's speed, where information moves fast, but rarely settles. As you leave the silent library, you feel no anger, only a soft grief, like realizing a favorite story was never finished. Tartarian science, in this telling, was not destroyed in a single act. It was diluted, redistributed, quieted, until it became myth. And myths, the voice whispers, are simply truths waiting for the right listener. You step back into the night, the echo of empty shelves following you, light and non-intrusive. As the journey continues, the sound reaches you before the structure does. Not loud, not sharp, a low, rounded presence that seems to spread rather than strike. You follow it the way one follows warmth in the dark, until you arrive at a tower crowned with openings, cables, pipes, and frames that look unfinished, only because their purpose is no longer remembered. Tartarian science, in this chapter of the journey, begins to sing. Bells hang here, but not as solitary voices. They are grouped, aligned, spaced with intention. Some are immense, others modest, each tuned to a different depth. You notice how the metal has aged evenly, how nothing appears ornamental without function. These are not decorations, they are components. The wise voice beside you slows even further, as if matching the tempo of the sound. It reminds you that before electricity travelled through wires, sound travelled through cities. Bells marked time. Yes, but they also marked coherence. When a bell rang, everything within its reach vibrated together, however slightly. Bodies, walls, water, air. You imagine a city designed as a resonant network, towers positioned so their tones overlapped without clashing. bells answering one another across districts, not with messages, but with alignment, like a nervous system made of sound rather than impulse. You walk beneath archways where organs once breathed. Pipes rise into walls, disappear into ceilings, re-emerge elsewhere. These were not church instruments alone. They were architectural lungs. When played, air moved. Pressure shifted. Spaces synchronized. Tartarian science, in this bedtime telling, understood resonance as connective tissue, not metaphorically, but physically. Certain frequencies travel farther, others penetrate deeper. Some calm, some stimulate. The right combination could soothe crowds, sharpen focus, even ease tension during conflict. You think of how modern cities manage people with signs, sirens, alarms, loud, jarring, directive. Contrast that with a city gently tuned by sound, where daily rhythms were reinforced by vibration rather than command. The voice does not claim certainty. It asks you to feel the idea, to imagine waking to a low bell that settles your breathing, midday tones that keep markets calm, evening harmonics that signal rest not with force, but invitation. You sit beneath the tower and let the imagined sound wash over you. Your shoulders drop, your jaw softens. Whether the bells ever served this purpose matters less than how natural the idea feels. As you rise to continue, the sound fades, but the calm remains. Tartarian science hums quietly now, less like a theory and more like a memory your body recognizes. You walk on, guided by that inner resonance, ready to follow it upward, toward the sky once more. You feel the lift before you see the sky open. The ground seems to loosen its hold on you as towers rise again, taller this time, more slender, reaching upward with a confidence that feels familiar now. You are no longer surprised by height. You are curious about purpose. Tartarian science, in this chapter of the journey, turns its attention to the air itself and to the stories of craft that once moved through it without fear. You stand at the base of a spire crowned with ironwork, rings, and branching arms that stretch outward like quiet invitations. These are not antennas in the modern sense. They feel older, simpler, designed for contact rather than transmission. You notice how many such towers exist, scattered across cities that no longer remember why they were built this way. The voice beside you speaks softly, almost fondly, of airships, not the roaring machines of later centuries, but vessels that drifted, that listened to wind rather than fought it. Old photographs and drawings show bulbous shapes hovering above rooftops, tethered lightly, as if visiting rather than conquering the sky. You imagine these craft approaching towers slowly, guided by ropes, guided by patience. No rush, no spectacle. Towers acting as mooring points, grounding structures, balancing charge, stabilizing pressure. The same principles you have seen before: resonance, flow, gentleness, applied now to travel through air. The wise voice does not insist these airships were widespread or common. It suggests they were possible, that the infrastructure hints at a capability later abandoned: towers too tall for flags, platforms too open for bells alone, rooftops too flat, too reinforced, too intentional. You walk onto one such platform and feel the wind move evenly around you. No sharp gusts, no turbulence. The structure seems to soften the air's behavior. You imagine a craft docking here, fabric hull brushing gently against supports, passengers stepping down without noise or panic. Travel, in this imagined Tartarian system, would not separate earth and sky. It would connect them, airships complementing canals, roads, and sound networks, a multi-layered world where movement occurred in harmony rather than competition. You think of how modern flight feels: loud, pressurized, sealed off from sensation, necessary, efficient, but harsh. Compare that with drifting, with feeling wind direction through your body, with trusting structure rather than overpowering it. The voice reminds you that when systems disappear, They often leave behind only their anchor points. Towers without craft, docks without ships, roads without travelers. Over time, explanations shrink. What once felt obvious becomes speculative. As you step back from the platform, the sky stretches wide and forgiving above you. Whether or not airships once glided here matters less than the pattern you now recognize. Tartarian science, in every form you've seen, sought partnership with air, with water, with sound, with the human body itself. You look up one last time, imagining silent silhouettes crossing the moon, and feel no longing, only calm. The journey continues downward now, back toward Earth, carrying with it the quiet certainty that the sky was once closer than we remember. You feel the shift immediately. The calm you have been carrying does not vanish, but it becomes quieter, as if wrapped in cloth. The landscape ahead is bright, polished, celebratory. Music plays, banners hang. People gather in awe. Tartarian science, in this chapter of the journey, does not disappear. It is dressed up, renamed, and placed on display. You walk into a grand exhibition. Buildings rise quickly here, almost too quickly. Their facades ornate but temporary, their foundations shallow. They look magnificent, yet strangely hollow. The voice beside you speaks gently, without accusation. It tells you this is how resets often look. Not like destruction, but like celebration. World fairs, expositions, showcases of progress. You recognize the images. Massive halls crowned with domes, towers lit brilliantly at night, machines presented as marvels. The crowds are told they are witnessing the future. Few realize they may also be saying goodbye to the past. You move through exhibition streets and feel a subtle mismatch. Structures echo the forms you have seen before, arches, spires, symmetry, but something is missing. The hum is gone. The resonance feels dampened. These buildings impress the eyes, but do not settle the body. They are imitations without inheritance. The wise voice suggests that after a reset, continuity is dangerous. It invites comparison. So instead, continuity is masked. Old systems are rebranded as obsolete. New systems are framed as inevitable. Progress becomes a story told loudly enough to cover the sound of forgetting. You notice how exhibitions emphasize control. Power switches, levers, lights, activated by spectacle. Energy is demonstrated as something commanded, not something harmonized. Crowds cheer. The message is clear. Mastery replaces relationship. Empires grow comfortable in such environments. Centralized systems favor centralized authority. Tartarian science, distributed and subtle, would not fit easily into this new narrative. It could not be owned cleanly. It could not be metered simply, so it fades into folklore. You pause before a grand tower built only to be dismantled. Temporary greatness. Impressive, but fleeting. You imagine older towers that stood quietly for centuries, no longer understood, now overshadowed by novelty. The voice does not condemn those who lived through this transition. It reminds you that people adapt. They accept what is offered. They trust the story they are told. And over time, the mask becomes the face. As the exhibition lights dim, you step away, carrying the understanding that resets do not always arrive with fire or flood. Sometimes they arrive with applause. The celebration fades behind you, and with it, the brightness that demanded attention. The path ahead is quieter, narrower, almost ordinary. Tartarian science, in this part of the journey, no longer announces itself through grand structures or public marvels. It survives instead in fragments, in habits, in people who never claimed to remember anything extraordinary. You meet them without realizing it at first. A stonemason who still taps walls and listens before placing a block. A bell ringer who insists certain tones feel better at dawn than at noon. A gardener who aligns beds with sunrise rather than property lines. None of them speak of Tartaria. None of them use grand words. They simply do things the way they were taught. The wise voice walks softly here, respectful. It reminds you that not all survivors flee into hiding. Some remain in plain sight, carrying forward pieces of a system without understanding its full shape. Knowledge, when threatened, often disguises itself as tradition. You notice buildings that feel different from their neighbors, not newer, not older, just calmer. Their proportions rest easily on the land. Their courtyards hold sound gently. Their water flows cleanly. These places are not labeled historical. They are still in use. And that is how they survived. You think of crafts passed down without explanation, techniques justified by, "That's how it's always been done." In those phrases, entire sciences can sleep unnoticed. Tartarian science, if it endured at all, would do so this way, distributed, humble, unremarkable. The voice does not romanticize this survival. It acknowledges loss. Most of the system is gone. Connections broken, meanings thinned, but something remains, enough to remind you that erasure is rarely complete. You walk through a small town at night and hear a bell ring, not loudly, not ceremonially, just once. The air shifts slightly. Dogs settle. Lights dim. You feel it in your chest. Whether coincidence or design, the moment feels intact. As you move on, you realize this section of the story is about continuity without recognition, about how truth does not always need to be known to be lived. Tartarian science lingers not in archives, but in gestures, in rhythms, in quiet choices made without applause. The night deepens, and the path narrows further. Ahead lies the final questioning, not of buildings or systems, but of humanity itself. You walk toward it slowly, carrying the comfort that something gentle survived, even if its name did not. You feel the shift inward before the path changes outward. There are fewer structures now, fewer landmarks to interpret. The journey has been narrowing toward something quieter, something harder to point at. Tartarian science, in this chapter, no longer presents itself as architecture, sound, or system. It turns into a question about you. You slow your steps. The world around you feels vast again, but not overwhelming. Open land stretches ahead, dimly lit, neither wild nor cultivated, just present. The wise old voice beside you does not speak for a long moment. When it finally does, it asks gently, if a civilization could live in balance with its world, what does that say about the purpose of being human? This is not a challenge. It is an invitation. You think back through everything you have seen, the star-shaped forts that felt like instruments, the cathedrals that breathed with the sky, the buried floors hiding older lives, the water that flowed like memory, the sound that calmed cities, the towers that reached upward without conquest. Together, they form a picture that is less about technology and more about orientation, a way of being. Modern stories often frame humanity as separate from nature, locked in struggle with it, racing to overcome limits. Tartarian science, as this bedtime story imagines it, suggests another role entirely. Not ruler, not victim, participant. You sit on the ground and feel its firmness beneath you. You notice your breath aligning with the night air, your heartbeat steady and unremarkable. Nothing dramatic happens, and that feels right. Meaning, the voice reminds you, is rarely dramatic. It is sustained. If humanity once built systems that amplified calm, what did they believe about the mind? If they valued resonance over speed, what did they believe about time? If they designed cities that eased the body rather than strained it, what did they believe about life's purpose? You are not asked to answer. Answers harden. Tonight is about wondering. Perhaps Tartarian science was not lost because it failed, but because it asked too much of us. It required patience, listening, responsibility. Those are harder to scale than engines, harder to monetize than power. You think of how history often remembers conquerors, not caretakers, loud events, not long balances. A civilization that avoided spectacle might leave little behind except harmony, and harmony is easy to overlook. The voice does not mourn this. It simply observes that meaning changes when context changes. What once felt obvious becomes invisible. What once felt necessary becomes quaint. And yet, something inside you responds to the idea of a quieter past, as if recognizing a forgotten home. You stand and look at the horizon. Where night and dawn begin to blur, the grand question lingers, not as pressure, but as warmth. If humanity's role is not to dominate, but to harmonize, what kind of future would feel natural? You do not need to decide tonight. The story is almost finished. The final walk will not add new mysteries. It will soften the ones you carry. You take one last slow breath and continue forward, ready to let the questions rest beside you rather than inside you. You arrive without realizing you are arriving. There is no gate, no sign, no dramatic threshold. The path simply widens, then gently dissolves, as if it were never meant to end sharply. Tartarian science, at the close of this journey, does not offer one final revelation. It offers return. You walk through what feels like an ordinary place. A quiet street, a field at rest, a doorway left slightly open. Nothing here demands interpretation, and yet everything feels familiar in a way that is deeper than memory. The wise old voice beside you is almost silent now, speaking only when necessary, like someone making sure you are settled before sleep. You pass doors that seem to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Old corridors that feel warm rather than abandoned. These are the sleeping doors, not sealed, not locked, just waiting. The voice suggests that knowledge does not vanish. It rests. It waits for conditions gentle enough to welcome it back. You think of everything you have walked through tonight, and it no longer feels fragmented. The forts, the cathedrals, the water, the sound, the air, all of it feels like one long sentence spoken slowly across centuries. Tartarian science was never a collection of inventions. It was a posture toward the world, a way of standing, building, listening, and leaving space. As you slow to a stop, the questions that once stirred curiosity now soften. You no longer need to resolve whether Tartaria was an empire, a culture, a misremembered system, or a symbolic mirror. The meaning has already settled where it needed to settle in the body, in the breath, in the sense that another way of living has always been possible. You realize something gently profound. Even if such a civilization never existed exactly as imagined, the longing for it did, and longing itself is information. It tells you what feels missing. It tells you what feels true, even when facts remain uncertain. The night wraps around you like a blanket. The wise voice offers no conclusion, only reassurance. Nothing important has been taken from you. Nothing urgent is required of you. You are allowed to rest with unanswered questions. And now, the story slows even more, easing into its final breath. The images begin to fade, not abruptly, but the way dreams do when they know you are safe. The towers grow distant, their outlines softening into silhouettes. The sound of bells dissolves into a low, steady hush, like wind moving through tall grass. The canals become reflections, then simply the idea of water, then only the feeling of coolness and calm. Your breathing lengthens. Thoughts that once reached outward now settle inward, like birds returning to roost. The questions you carried no longer ask to be answered. They curl up beside you, quiet and content. You are reminded, gently, that history does not belong only to the past. It lives in instincts, in preferences for quiet spaces, in your relief when noise fades, in your comfort with slow understanding. Whether Tartarian science was real, symbolic, or somewhere in between, the calm it represents is real right now. Nothing needs to be proven tonight. Nothing needs to be remembered perfectly. You have already done enough simply by listening, by wondering without strain, by allowing mystery to feel kind instead of threatening. The world grows still. The path disappears entirely, not because it is gone, but because you no longer need to walk it. Rest arrives naturally, like dusk turning into night without announcement, and as sleep takes you gently, you carry one final, soothing thought. There are other ways to live, other ways to build, other ways to be, and remembering that possibility is sometimes the most peaceful knowledge of all.